In this module, I'll be covering the analytics apps. I'll be showing you how to create a new analytic app using Boolean queries, helping you understand how much history will be available in that app, what some of the configuration options are of the various analytics apps, and then how to find insights by drilling into specific data points and comparing different analytics. So I'm going to start by creating a new tab to house my analysis. And again, from the Eastern quadrant, I'll be adding this time the social analytics app, and I'll start with just one. Now, the analytics app is configured in really exactly the same way as the track topic app. So if you've already configured a track topic app, then you'll be able to configure the analytics app as well. And I'm actually going to reuse the query from my track topic that I created in the previous module. So I'll actually just go in and edit that app and copy this query. And we'll use that in a moment. So again, we have three main parameters to fill out, starting with sources. So you have all the same sources available to you as per the track topic. So in this case, I will configure the analytics app with the three libraries that I have on my dashboard. And then click apply. And then we'll go to the topic. And again, this is exactly the same as with the track topic. So I'll just paste in the query that I have. One thing that I'd like to re-emphasize is that this query will search the full text of each article that's in our libraries. So we go out and actually crawl the full article content, so you know that everything in that article is being searched for. And I'd also like to talk about a few things within this query specifically that are worth noting. So the first thing is that most special characters are ignored. That means that they're ignored if you type them into the query, and then we ignore them actually in the text of the document that we're searching as well. So that means that when we search for smart speaker as one word, that will pick up any smart speaker hashtags as well, because the pound or hash symbol is ignored. You can look at the documentation to see the full list of the special characters that we recognize and ignore. So these are the ones that we recognize. Typically, they tend to be currency symbols, and a few that are particularly useful because they, in the case of the ampersand, there are a lot of short proper nouns of companies that have that ampersand in there. And the @ sign can be helpful to differentiate between replies on Twitter and just general words without the @ sign. But other than these, the special characters are ignored. So, and that goes for accents as well. So in the case of an accent, if you search for an accented word, it will match the accented words, but it will also match those same words without the accented character. And then likewise for the special character. So you could search for a particular word with a special character, but it will match the base form of that word, or any word with a special character adjacent to it. And that is a good thing, because generally, and we've basically picked and chosen which special characters we do and don't want to ignore. And this means that generally they're ignored in the cases where you'd want them to be. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is that just how we've formed this query, how it's structured, specifically around these parentheses. So the parentheses that basically group this initial part of the query and then this second part of the query basically tell the interpreter which order to process the query in, and it basically has the effect of grouping all of these parts together, and they will get processed together, and this section will also get processed together. And in this case, it means that we have this query where we're basically saying, I want results that say smart speaker or smart speaker or smart speakers or smart speakers. Could have any of those, and then any one of those must be near any one of these pricing terms in the second part of the query. If we were to remove a couple of these parentheses and change where they are and maybe add a couple of new ones, if we did something like this, we're actually ending up with something quite different, because we have a query that says basically we could match a document with any one of these terms, or it would have to have smart speakers near pricing, or it could have any one of these terms. So we would match a document that just said price. We would match a document that just said smart speaker. So it's definitely important to think about where you put these parentheses, just because it does basically determine how the query is going to be interpreted. So let's again click apply to save that query in the configuration. We have updated results now, and the final configuration option is the period. So I'd like to talk about this a little bit more than I did in the track topic session, just because it's more relevant when it comes to the analysis, because with the track topic, you're really just looking at the last few articles. With an analysis, this is determining what set of data is going to be displayed in your chart. So first of all, you'll see that the default is your attention. Now, when we crawl any article that's published in one of the sources on the dashboard, we will retain that article for your retention period, which generally is 90 days. That's the default. So unless you've purchased a 12-month package, you can assume that your retention will be 90 days. So it makes sense that the default option for the period is going to be your retention period. One other note on the retention is that if you have libraries that have built up a history of 90 days, it means that you have that full 90 days of history at your disposal to be represented in any charts that you create. However, if you've built a new library today and added brand new sources to it, you will only have a history starting today. That history will build up over time until you get to 90 days, in which point you'll have a full 90-day history. So that is our first option, and that usually is a good kind of default just to leave alone unless you have a reason to look at a different time period. So if you do, you can click on define a period, and you have a couple of ways that you can define the time period that you want to look at. So the first option is just to go ahead and click in the date picker. So we can select a start date of maybe the 1st of January. We could then select an end date, maybe of today's date. What this will do is set the start and end date as two static dates, so these will never change. If you come back to the dashboard in a week's time, in a month's time, it will always be, this analytic app will always be looking at a time period of the 1st of January to the 26th of February. So that is good if you're creating a report and you basically want it always to be looking at those same dates. However, I'd say the more common scenario is to actually look at a rolling time period. So whenever you come to the dashboard, it's always looking at the prior week, maybe 2 weeks, 1 month, or maybe up to 3 months. And the way to do that is to specify a dynamic date. And these are pretty simple. The easiest way to do it, for your start date, that's going to want to be in the past. So we'll start with a minus sign. And then to do 1 week ago, you would just type in 1 week. To do 1 month ago, we could change that to 1 month. And you can obviously change that integer as well. But it's always going to be a minus sign, an integer, and then a unit. So that unit could be hours, days, weeks, months, years, depending on how much retention you have. And then the integer can be whatever value you want. The other important dynamic value is now. So if you do now, it will always go up to the current point in time. So this is going to go from 2 months ago. You can add the S or not, we'll understand either one. So it will go from 2 months ago until now. So that's a pretty standard method. I'd say most commonly we'll use a dynamic date range like this when we're creating an analysis. The other dynamic format that I think is quite useful is to do something like this. So if you want to have a report that always starts on the first of the prior month and goes to the end of the prior month, we could do something like first day of last month to last day of last month. And this will always set the analysis to the month prior to the current month. So in this case, today's date is the 26th of February. So the analysis will be set to the 1st of January to the 31st of January. The moment today's date rolls over to the 1st of March, it will then be set to the month of February. So it allows you, for a scenario where it's important to be looking at a calendar month in terms of reporting, it will always be looking at the prior complete calendar month, but it will be rolling. So it won't just always be stuck on January forevermore. It will roll over as you go to the next month. So in this case, I will actually just pick the simple option and go with your retention. However, if you do have an interest in those dynamic date period values, they are in the query syntax documentation. So again, we'll click apply. And one final best practice before we actually create one of the apps is that it becomes really important to make sure your query is actually accurate when you start to create analyses. It is really tempting once you start seeing some results coming in to start creating the different analytics apps. But if you then realize your query actually wasn't quite as good as it could have been, it maybe isn't returning 100% relevant results, you then have to go back, tweak the query. Then if you've created 6 or 7 analytics apps, you'll have to go back and update each one. And obviously if you have to do that a few times, then it starts to become a bit cumbersome. So I definitely recommend spending some time reviewing the articles, making sure that they're actually relevant before you start creating the analytics. So we have 4 apps that we can choose from. These are basically starting points, and you'll see that there are a number of configuration options that we can use to go a bit further than just the default configuration of each one. But in general, what is said will show us either how much content has been published or specifically what it was talking about. Where is it happening talks about where in a few different contexts. So where is it happening on the internet, which sites or which media types is the content being published to, but also where is it happening geographically by location. Who is talking is really talking about the authors of the articles, and then how is it perceived allows us to see the perception of the article. Is it an article that we perceive to be positive or negative based on our sentiment analysis? Or potentially it can leverage our opinions feature, which I'll be showing, which basically represents the results of any opinions that have been added to the articles. So I'm going to create my kind of standard complete analysis. And I'll start with the What Is Said app, and just to give you an idea of some of the configuration options before we actually go into the other apps. So this is what the What Is Said app looks like by default. It will show you basically how many articles are published day by day for this particular subject. So there are a few configuration options that I'd like to highlight. So first of all, we have the metric switcher. So for each of the apps, each of the 4 analytics apps, you will have a few options in terms of which metric it's actually displaying. So right now we're displaying the articles metric, but if we switch to keywords view, we get quite a different representation of the data. So we went from showing the number of articles to actually showing what they're discussing, specifically what kind of language is being used in the articles, other than what we searched for. So that's the metric switcher. We also have the ability to change the chart type, which can definitely be useful. Certain views can be more pertinent to different use cases, so you have some options there. And then there are also a number of options within the preferences, and these will vary depending on the particular app. For the What Is Said app, when it's set to articles view, the main ones to consider are you have a comparison option. So if you select compare to, you can add a comparison start date, which will compare the data from the current time period to the data that was published this time period prior to the start date. So that can definitely be useful to basically do an over-time comparison. The range sets the unit that each data point on the chart represents. So right now we have the chart set to daily. So if we go back to our chart, you can see that each point represents 1 day of data. I find that the 2 kind of most common options are either daily or weekly, but the weekly can be useful just to get an idea of that weekly trend, particularly if you have a subject that decreases in volume a lot at the weekend. A daily chart is just going to highlight the fact that it's always going up and down, week versus a weekday versus weekend, and the weekly will actually allow you to see the trend over time a bit better, particularly if you're looking at a longer time period. So those are probably the most common options, but definitely just have a play around with the 2 to see which makes the most sense for your particular app. And I will come back to these in a moment. So then at the bottom of the app, we have the detail section. So this gives you some information about how the app is configured in terms of the data it's looking at, what sources it's using, what the topic is, and you can also edit the topic directly from here, what the period is, and how much autosave you have. So if you weren't sure if you had 90 days or 12 months, then this is the place to confirm that. And then down at the bottom, we can set the series title and color. And I do recommend doing this for a couple of reasons. So first of all, by default, we actually have a dynamic title. So let me make that a little bit bigger so we can see it. And by default, the What Is Said app will say what is said about, and then it will use the name of the main series in the app. So if we change this to smart speakers, click update, that will update our title. Both the series title and the series color can also be really useful when it comes to doing a comparison. If we're comparing 5 or 6 different series, setting this name before we do that comparison means that in the comparison app, those names will still be associated with the right series, so there's less confusion about which which series is which. It just makes it a lot more clear. Then also down below we have some insights. So these are definitely worth checking out just to get a feel for what the data is actually representing, what is it doing. Sometimes it can be easier to leverage these automated insights than get a visual idea. So for example, trying to tell whether this data set is trending up or down over time. It's not always possible, especially if it's really up and down. Here we know that it is trending upward overall based on the linear regression. We can also see the high point and the low point and also predict what the expected value will be for tomorrow. So that's our first app. So what I'm going to do is continue building my kind of standard analysis using the rest of the 4 apps. And actually this app configured in a different way. So I'm going to start actually by duplicating this app, because in addition to my what is said app set to articles, I'd also like to have another what is said app set to keywords, and actually a few of them. So we'll start by duplicating this. And I'll keep this one at the top. This one we're actually going to switch to keywords view. So we can see what people are actually discussing, what type of topics are most prominent in these articles. And I'm going to make a couple of configuration changes. So first of all, in the preferences, I'm going to delete my title so that it's dynamic. I'm going to change the limit here, which will basically adjust how many results we get in this chart. So right now we have 5. I recommend going at least up to 50 so we can get a better idea of the complete list. And then at the bottom we have a list of the types of words and phrases that will actually appear in the chart. So this list represents all of the different entities that we can extract from the articles. So right now we're showing everything. Sometimes it makes sense to show everything together. I typically like to break these out separately so we can see the names of the companies separately from the names of the events and the people and the places and so on. So I'm actually going to uncheck most of these, click on save. And now we just have the organizations. So now I'll duplicate this a few more times. And each time I'm going to set it to a different type of entity. So this one will be events. This one will be people. This one will be locations. This one will be hashtags. And then this one will do themes and expressions. Okay, so those are our what is said apps, and we now have basically a trend line over time, and we can also see a lot of the different terms that are being discussed about slightly different subjects. And what I'd also recommend doing in this scenario is to actually rename each of these so we know which type of entity it's actually representing. Okay, so let's now move on to the next app. So the first way we could do this is to just add a new social analytics app. This time we're going to add a How Is It Perceived app. So we'll add a new one, we'll go ahead and configure it. We'll select our sources. And then use that same query and keep that same retention period. And this time I'll select How Is It Perceived. So this app, again, does have two different metrics that it will display. It will display emotion, which is the automated sentiment analysis, and then sentiments, which is the result of any opinions that have been added to the article manually by the users of the dashboard. So right now, since we haven't added any of those, I'm going to just focus on the emotion. I find that this app can be useful, or particularly useful in set up in a couple of ways. So the first is to view over time how those articles are trending in terms of sentiment. This is one of the places where I find that looking at a weekly period can be a bit more useful than daily. So I can see how that trend is changing on a weekly basis and can often highlight the trends a bit more clearly. And then I will also duplicate the app so we can see the whole time period as one. Before I do that, I'm just going to make sure I remember to edit my series title so that that's retained when I duplicate. It's always worth making any updates to the configuration that you want to be retained before you start duplicating. So I'll duplicate this app. And this time, I actually just want to see what the overall sentiment is of this subject. So I'm going to switch to a pie chart view. Now I have both of those displays available without having to perform any configuration. I can see the overall sentiment, and if there was a week with worse sentiment than the standard. And I'll just update the title as well. There we go. So another way to create a new analytics app that actually leverages any configuration that you've already done to an existing one that you have on your dashboard is to actually drill in to any data point in that app. I find the What Is Said app is the easiest to reconfigure. So if we want to create a Where Is It Happening app, I'll click here, click on Where Is It Happening. This will create a new app which uses that same configuration but is just looking at one particular date. So I'll pin this to my dashboard, leave it in the current dashboard and current tab. And then just move that down to the bottom. So since this is looking at one day right now and I actually want to keep it the same time period as the other apps, I'll just edit the query and change that time period to your attention. So rather than having to copy and paste the topic, maybe select different sources, all I needed to do was just click on your attention, and now I have the same configuration as all of the other apps. So the Where Is It Happening app has 3 different metrics that are available, and I'd like to see all 3 on the dashboard without having to do any reconfiguration. So I'll duplicate this twice. And at the top, I'll have media. Again, I'll just edit that title so that it's dynamic. So I have the media types that the articles are most published in. Then we can get into a bit more detail and actually see the domains that the subject is most published to. And then on the final one, we'll do the location. So we can see geographically where these articles, what types of locations are being discussed in these articles. And so we have 3 of the different apps on our dashboard now, and there's one more that I'd like to add, which is the Who is Talking app. So I'll create this in the same way, just by drilling into an existing app, clicking on Who is Talking, and then adding that to my dashboard. So one thing to note with the Who is Talking app is that the author is not always going to be available. Not every publisher provides an author. Some publishers consider the author just to be the site. So you can see here we have Engadget and Gizbot as the author, even just because they don't name the author in the RSS feed. There's a kind of quick way to remove these from appearing in the app, so it focuses more just on the authors. So I will show you how to do that. First of all, we need to just update that time period, just like we did for the previous app. So we'll click on period, click on your attention, and now we're seeing that full 90 days of history again. And what we can do to remove those invalid authors is actually utilize the metrics that are available, specifically the author metric. And we can go through and select any of these that are not actual authors. So I'll go through and select these domains. And the other ones that I know are full sites. And they do tend to be at the top, which is why we have so many there. And as we go down, we'll start to get some individuals. Okay, we'll go to there. So if we click apply, we have basically added all of those authors to our query as an and. So right now we're actually seeing the exact inverse of what we want in the app. We're seeing just those articles that are published by the authors that we don't have. So if we go into our topic, you can see that these are all of our authors that we don't want. So what we can actually do here is leverage the not Boolean operator, and this will exclude all of those results from our query. You can click on apply. We're now seeing everything but those. If we click on save changes, we'll have an output here that is a lot more useful. There are also a couple of metrics that are available in the Who Talks About app. We can also see just Twitter authors and retweeters. So again, I'll duplicate this a couple of times. Update the title. And this one will set to, actually this one will set to authors. This one will set to Twitter authors. So we can see the original author of the content, even if it's a retweet that we've picked up. And then this one, we can see just the retweeters. So that is my standard analysis that really gives a pretty good holistic view of the subject. We can see how that subject is trending over time. We can see generally what is the overall sentiment of that subject. We can see how the sentiment is trending over time. And we can see various different types of themes that are present in those articles, which are the key players in terms of companies that are getting coverage in this segment, which events are being talked about, which people are being discussed, which locations are being mentioned, which hashtags are being mentioned, and then which themes and expressions are being discussed. We can then see the authors of the articles overall, as well as on Twitter. And then we can see where the content is being published, both broadly in terms of the media type, a bit more specifically in terms of the domain, and then geographically what types of places are being mentioned in those articles. Next, I'd like to show you how you can use some of the capabilities to interact with these charts to find insights in the underlying data. So with any of the apps on this tab, you have the ability to drill into any of the data points within the charts. So for example, in the What Is Said app, you can drill into any particular day. You can drill into a particular sentiment. You can drill into a particular theme that's being expressed. So to give an example, if we wanted to understand a bit more about why there was a spike on the 19th of February, we can click on that data point, and then we can look at that particular set of data, so just the articles talking about smart speaker pricing on the 19th of February, either in the context of one of the other analytics apps, or we can actually just go and read the articles themselves. So we'll start by looking at What Is Said. And this will initially give us a view that isn't so useful because it will just be showing us the number of articles that day, which we already know. But if we switch to Keywords view, we can see what was being discussed in those articles. And this is particularly useful if you have a large data set. If you're looking at hundreds or maybe over 1,000 articles, you don't have time to read all of those. You can see easily what's being discussed. So in this case, we have Marshall Acton at the top. So let's click on that to understand a bit more about why that's being discussed. If we then read the articles, we can actually see those articles that were discussing that topic, and we can see in this case that Amazon has dropped the price on the Marshall Acton 2 smart speaker. So it allowed us to very quickly understand what the cause for that particular change in the chart was. So next, I'd like to show you how you can actually take different topics and compare them. So this can be particularly useful in competitive scenarios when you want to compare maybe your own product with that of a competitor's, but even within the same product, it can be useful to compare different attributes of that product. So what we'll do is we'll take this existing analytic app that we've already created about smart speaker pricing, and we'll compare that with a slightly different query. So I'm going to duplicate this app and add it to a new tab, which we'll call Comparison. We can just drag that over. So we have one app here that's discussing smart speaker pricing. What I'd like to do is compare it to a different subtopic of smart speakers. So I'm going to create a second app, which is looking at smart speakers and when people talk about smart speakers and assistants. So I'm going to edit the query and just modify the existing topic that we had. We can actually use a pretty similar topic, but we'll just change this part of the query. So instead of picking up articles about pricing, it's articles that are talking about assistants. So we'll do assistant or assistants, maybe throw in a few misspellings just to capture any misspellings that occur as well. And then we'll do a few of the more common assistants that are out there. So we'll do Alexa and we'll do Siri. We don't need to add Google Assistant because we already have Assistant spelt out separately, so that will already be captured. So we'll click Apply, and then we'll save changes to that app. So we now have the same type of app, but a different query. So this one looking at smart speaker pricing, this one looking at assistants in the context of smart speakers. And before I actually compare these, what I'll do is I will edit the name of the series. So we'll do smart speakers pricing, and then we'll do smart speakers assistants. We'll also give this one a different color since that will be retained when we do the comparison. And this is the place where I mentioned earlier that when you start creating the analyses, you really want to make sure that your query is pretty solid and you're not going to have to edit it too much. This is where you really want to make sure that it's accurate, because once you start comparing apps, it gets a lot more difficult to edit the queries in them. So this is a place to kind of just pause for a moment and think to yourself, okay, is this accurate? Maybe go in and edit the app again and just read through those results, make sure they're actually what you're expecting. And if there are any anomalies in there, false positives, then just edit that topic to get them out. Once you've done that, the comparison is pretty simple. You'll see there's this icon in the top right, drag to compare. We can drag this first app onto this one, let go, and then we'll get a new app which contains both of the series, and we can see how those two series correlate, where there are similarities, if there's some kind of relationship between the two. We can see that visually, but also using the insights can be helpful, because we can see a few things like when the trend line of each one intersected with the other. If there are similarities or differences in terms of the overall trend, the high point, the low point, and so on. So that can be a useful addition to just the visual analysis. And then we'll add that to the dashboard. So we've compared two series there, but you can actually compare as many series as you like. So if you have a product with 10 or 12 different attributes, that's a really valid use case to compare those different attributes, see which of those is getting the most discussion, so that could maybe perhaps feed back into your product development. So the final thing I'd like to show in terms of analysis is where we can add in some human analysis. So this is our opinions feature, and if we go back to our monitoring tab, we can use this opinions feature to basically add our thoughts, our opinion to individual articles, and each opinion basically has two metrics, the opinion itself and then a sentiment. So if we find an article that is of interest, let's see, there's an article on Business Insider about the best speakers. We can then use this opinions icon to open up the opinion dialog. And then we have the ability to, first of all, add free text. So Perhaps this is talking about pricing. We could add a pricing opinion to the article, and we could maybe then add in an additional sentiment. So if this is talking about pricing in terms of being a strength or maybe being a weakness because they're too expensive, we can select that from the drop down. So we basically have a free text for the opinion, and then we have a set of existing sentiments that are available to us. So I could quickly go through and tag a few articles as being about pricing. So maybe this one is an opportunity. Maybe this one is also an opportunity. And having tagged those articles, those will now feed in to the How Is It Perceived app, and the results will be available in the sentiments metric. So if we switch to the sentiments view, we can then see the sentiments, the breakdown of the sentiments for any articles that are matched in this query. So this concludes the session on analytics. The final session will be on alerts and reporting.